so much for coming out tonight to fellowship with us as we honor the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I want to give a special recognition to my mom and dad who drove down from Kentucky for this occasion. Please say hi at some time, before you leave. So I want to piggyback off some of the things that Bree spoke about. Bree and both Teresa, they're scholars in the criminal justice department, and they have participated in discussions in my classroom in which I challenge students to really pay attention to the suffering, poverty, unfairness, and injustice among our people. So I really want to build off some of those words that Bree spoke about in her poem by sharing with you a recent conversation that I had with my niece. Over Christmas break, my then 11-year-old niece, who my sister appropriately named Love, she asked me a question that I really, did not know how to answer right out. She says to me, "Auntie, are you happy with yourself?" And I asked, "What do you mean?" And she repeated, "Are you happy with yourself?" I still had no idea really, it seemed to be a layered question to me. I was wondering, is she talking about the fact that I'm not married yet? Is it because I've been prepping, for classes over the holidays when I could be playing with her? What is she talking about? So she goes on to say, "You should be happy with yourself. You have accomplished a lot in life, especially for a Black woman. Black people are judged just because of the color of their skin. They're not viewed as smart and talented as they actually are, and they're not given a fair chance like white people. Black people have a much tougher life than white people, so you should be proud of yourself." And I thought, wow, where did that come from? So I grabbed her by the hand and I said, "Thank you, love. I appreciate that. And you are right. Black people do face a lot of challenges in life. And I am proud of myself." But I was really just in complete amazement about the compassion and consciousness that is within Love. And although I would really like to take a lot of credit for her consciousness, the truth about it is that she has spent much of her young life sitting at the feet of her Black grandmother and Black grandparents, and has really listened to stories about racial segregation in Kentucky and racial discrimination on the job. She has even witnessed unfair treatment towards Black students at school, particularly her own Black brother, who, when he was a 6th grader, having no record of misconduct, he was suspended from school when he defended himself against a bully who followed him home on the bus to fight him. So these things have impacted her awareness about what's going on in the world. And so as I began to think about what I would talk to you tonight in regards to institutional racism, I began to reflect on what does it mean to love. Because of Dr. King's God-given strength to love, he was dissatisfied with the whole structure of American society. In his 1963 letter from a Birmingham jail, he shared that throughout his short lifetime, he had seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, brutalize, and even kill Black men and women with impunity. He saw vicious mobs rush into Black communities and lynch mothers and fathers, and drown brothers and sisters, and even at any given moment without punishment from the state. He went to Black-only schools where the desks and the chairs and the textbooks were of lower quality than those at schools for white students. He saw Black people turned away at lunch counters when simply trying to buy a cup of coffee. He saw Black people turned away at the voting booths, even though it was their legal right. He saw the vast majority of 20 million Blacks suffer in poverty in an affluent American society. He had to explain to his Black daughter that she could not go to a public amusement park that had been advertised on television and how he watched tears well up in her little eyes when he told her that Fun Town is not open to colored children. He had to concoct an answer to his 5-year-old son when he asked, "Daddy, why are white people so mean to colored people?" Too often he had to sleep in a car because motels would not accept him. Dr. King and all those who looked like him were humiliated day in and day out by nagging signs labeled whites or colored. And through all of this, including the bombing of his own home, Dr. King responded with love.
Amen.
For he knew that love was ultimately the only answer to mankind's problems. Mankind's problems stem from institutional racism that is embedded in the whole structure of American society. Joe Fagan, the author of Systemic Racism, A Theory of Oppression, he defines systemic racism as a broad range of white racist dimensions. The racist ideology, attitudes, emotions, habits, actions, and institutions of whites in this society. This means that systemic racism is something much greater than racial prejudice and individual bigotry. It is a material, social, and ideological reality that's well embedded in major U.S. institutions. Can I stop right here just to tell you a little bit something about myself so that you can feel where I'm coming from tonight? Is that all right? Okay. Thank you. So it was at Howard University while training for my PhD in sociology and criminology where I truly became conscious about systemic racial oppression through exposure to research conducted by scholars who challenged mainstream analysis about the framework of this country. You see, the Mecca is a concentrated space for the Black struggle. It is at Howard where I stood on the steps of some of our great leaders, such as Dr. King and Frederick Douglass and Thurgood Marshall and Stokely Carmichael and many other men and women college students who became deeply involved in the freedom rides and sit-ins and other demonstrations that challenged segregation in American society. It was also at Howard where Black students mourned and moved about in the days after a wealthy white male real estate agent was named president-elect of these United States on a platform that promised to make America great again. And as Reverend Sharon said, many of us were wondering, when was America ever so great? And it is at Howard where we embrace the motto of truth and service. Therefore, tonight, to honor the life and legacy of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., I came to deliver the hard, brutal, and unbelievable facts. A year before Dr. King was assassinated, he urged us to begin to raise questions about the whole society. In order to do that, you must understand that historically wealthy white men, for the most part, have never truly valued the humanity of the African or the African American. In fact, the wealth of white male landowners was dependent upon violence and the exploitation of Africans into forced-free labor called chattel slavery. Prior to the end of chattel slavery in 1865, Blacks were not regarded as citizens by most whites in the U.S. Supreme Court. Therefore, for us to critique why 39% of Black children and adolescents and 33% of Latino children and adolescents are presently living in poverty, which is more than double the 14% of white and Asian students. We have to understand how the U.S. is explicitly founded on racial oppression by European immigrants. It began with the genocidal killing off of Native Americans and the theft of their lands, and the extensive enslavement of Africans as laborers on those stolen lands. Post-slavery, Since blacks were not regarded as citizens, very few had access to wealth generating resources, such as public lands provided by the state and federal governments to many white citizens. This meant that new European immigrant families were able to build substantial wealth for many generations to come. Today, there are more than 50 million white families that are descendants of public land that was allocated by the government. Therefore, whites have been able to pass down income and wealth from generation to generation, which explains why they can provide much better educational, housing, and other socio-economic opportunities for their children than black families. This is institutional racism because the ancestors of black families are the ones who labored on that land for 400 years and were excluded from those wealth-generating resources because of massive racial discrimination and segregation. This exclusion was implemented by white male legislatures through racial segregation laws and enforced by violent white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan. Blacks were terrorized, lynched, discriminated, and legally segregated in institutions such as employment, housing, education, politics, policing, public accommodations, religion, medical and healthcare facilities, social services, and recreation. Dr. King sacrificed his life for the passage of civil rights legislation that made it illegal for whites to exclude blacks from such institutions. But please understand that 50 years since he was gunned down in that motel in Memphis, Tennessee was not that long ago. You have to understand that racial discrimination is a continuum and is enforced through major institutions. So let me provide you with some current facts. Black unemployment rates are typically double that of whites. Black men working full-time earn only 70% of the average earnings comparable to white men and 85% of the earnings of white women. As a result of huge income and wealth inequalities, whites are much more likely to own homes than blacks. Blacks also tend to be charged higher rents, higher property taxes, and higher prices in many local stores, higher interest rates, and receive poorer social services than do whites. That's institutional racism. We should be concerned about the racial disparity in school suspensions here in North Carolina. During the 2015 to 2016 school year, black students in the Chapel Hill-Cabarrus school system were 10 times more likely to be suspended than whites, 9 times more likely in Durham, and 8 times more likely in Wake County. We should be concerned about this because consistent findings in the research tells us that students who are suspended from school are more likely to suffer a wide range of adverse outcomes, such as poor academic performance, school disengagement, school dropout, mental illness, and involvement in the juvenile justice system than higher rates in students who are not suspended from school. Therefore, since black students are disproportionately suspended, they are more likely to experience these negative outcomes than white students and Hispanics and others. That's institutional racism. A major injustice that I must mention is the feces from hog farming that is poisoning black communities here in North Carolina. In order to save money on the disposal of pig waste, for years, farmers have been disposing pig poop through pumps and sprayers that act like lawn sprinklers into fields near poor communities. Did you all know this?
No, but you can tell them, sis.
Residents are placed at increased risk for asthma, diarrhea, eye irritation, depression, high blood pressure, and cancer, and in some cases, death. Hog dumping operations are twice as likely to be near Black, Hispanic, and Native American communities than whites. That's institutional racism. There are many forms of institutional racism that I could share with you tonight, but you better believe Dr. King will want to know what's happening in our prisons. Our criminal justice system functions as a system of racial and social control rather than a system of crime prevention and control. It is no coincidence that Black adults account for 40% of persons incarcerated, but make up only 13% of the U.S. population. In North Carolina, Blacks make up 22% of the population, but account for 57% of the prison population. And there's no evidence that Blacks are more crime-prone than their other racial or ethnic counterparts. What we have to understand is what Bree told us about the felony convictions. So a felony conviction means that men and women cannot vote, serve on juries, and are legally discriminated against in employment and housing, access to education, and public benefits. So the eradication of many of the forms of racial discrimination that Dr. King and many others marched and shed blood for are suddenly legal again once one has been branded as a felon. That's institutional racism. And what is very critical for us to understand is that the collateral consequences for felony convictions make it challenging and nearly impossible for those individuals to acquire their basic needs to survive, like food, water, housing, education, healthcare, communication, and transportation. Therefore, the freedom that Dr. King fought and died for, as I said, has not been fully achieved because of a system of racist ideology that is enforced by our decision makers through policies and practices and hatred embedded in our hearts for people that are different from us. As I prepare to close, Dr. King, I want to explain to you that Dr. King understood very well that even after the passage of the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 65, that the battle was not over. The battle was not won. Just a year before his assassination at the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in May 1967, Dr. King delivered a speech entitled, "Where Do We Go From Here?" If you don't mind, I would like to quote a selected section from his speech because it is imperative that we hear his words in this moment. Dr. King said, "First, we must massively assert our dignity and worth. We must stand up amid a system that still oppresses us and develop an unassailable and majestic sense of values. We must no longer be ashamed of being Black. The Negro must rise up with an affirmation of his or her own Olympian manhood. As long as the mind is enslaved, the Negro can never be free. Psychological freedom, a firm sense of self-esteem, is the most powerful weapon against a long night of physical slavery. The Negro will only be free when he or she reaches down in the inner depths of his own being and signs with the pen and ink of assertive manhood of his own Emancipation Proclamation. And in the spirit of straining toward true self-esteem, the Negro must boldly throw away the manacles of self-admiration and say to him or herself and to the world, I am somebody. I am a person. I am a woman with dignity and honor. I have a rich history of a rich and noble history, however painful and exploited that history may have been. Yes, I was a slave through my foreparents. And now I'm not ashamed of the people who were so sinful to make me a slave. Yes, we must stand up and say, I'm Black. But I'm Black and beautiful. This self-affirmation is the black man and woman's need, made compelling by the white man's crimes against him or her. The second thing that I want to tell you that Dr. King says is that we need to discover how to organize our strength in economic and political power. And he says that power at its best is love, implementing the demands of justice. And justice at its best is love, correcting everything that stands against love. And this is what we must see and move on, said Dr. King in 1967. Lastly, I must emphasize that Dr. King prayed that all people would have the strength to love. But 50 years after he was assassinated, many human beings still do not have the strength to love. Let's face it. I have hope that God will heal the evil in people's hearts one day. But in the meantime, we have to figure out, how do we face adversity in our everyday lives? There is a scene in the movie Fences in which Denzel Washington's character was saying much of what Dr. King wants us to embrace today. Have any of you seen Fences?
Yeah.
Seen it? It's good, right? Okay, so and this is the values of courage, truth, justice, compassion, dignity, humility, and service to all that I think this line from Fences really brings out. So Fences is set in the 1950s, but the time frame does not date the material. So if you will, picture Denzel Washington's character Troy and his son Corey standing in the backyard having a talk. Corey asks his father, "How come you ain't never liked me?" Troy answers, "Like you? Who the hell said I got to like you? What law was there to say I got to like you? Want to stand up in my face and ask me a fool question like that, talking about liking somebody? A man is supposed to take care of his son. It is my duty to take care of you. It is my responsibility. It's not because I like you." Now let's get this straight right here and right now before we go any further. I ain't got to like you. Mr. Rand don't give me my money come payday because he like me. He give it to me because he owes me. Now don't you go through life worrying about whether somebody like you or not. You best be making sure they're doing right by you. Do you feel me? Yeah. Okay, I thought that you would.
Okay, feel like.
So what you have witnessed tonight, and what many of my students have learned about me this year, is that I am unapologetically black.
Yes, girl.
So as I leave you tonight, I want to encourage you to be unapologetically who God has made you to be. So if you are black, be unapologetically black. If you are white, be unapologetically white. If you are Native American, be unapologetically Native American. If you are Latino, be unapologetically Latino. And if you are Asian, be unapologetically Asian. And if you are a mixture of multiple races and ethnicities, be all of it unapologetically. Yeah. But please know this, that being who God made you to be means that you are to treat others with love. And remember that people don't have to like you, but you better make sure they do right by you.